The sirens were getting closer. I could hear them wailing through the rain-streaked windows of my lawyer's office, and all I could think was how fitting it was that the sky had opened up on the day I was finally signing the divorce papers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. Across from me, David sat perfectly still in his expensive suit. That same blank expression he'd perfected over our 32 years of marriage. The same face he'd worn when I'd confronted him 6 months ago. The same face he'd probably worn while he was with her. "Sign here," my attorney said quietly, sliding the papers toward me. I looked down at the signature line, and suddenly I was back there. Back to 3 months earlier, standing in the doorway of that hotel room, watching my husband's entire life unravel before my eyes. But let me back up. Let me tell you how I got here. My name is Margaret Chen, and until recently, I thought I had it all figured out. I'm 58 years old, living in Chicago, and I'd been married to David for what I thought was a lifetime of partnership. We had a beautiful home in Lincoln Park, 2 grown children, and a granddaughter who was the light of my life. David owned a successful consulting firm, and I'd retired early from teaching to help him build it. That's what partners do, right? They sacrifice, they support, they believe. God, I believed. I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in April, unseasonably warm for Chicago. I was at the grocery store on Clark Street, picking up ingredients for dinner. David had mentioned he was working late again, the 3rd time that week, and I was planning his favorite meal as a surprise. Pathetic, looking back on it now. I was reaching for a bottle of his preferred wine when a woman's voice behind me said, "Margaret? Margaret Chen." I turned to see a woman I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. Sarah something. She lived a few blocks over. "Oh, hi," I said, trying to place her. "I saw David last week," she said brightly. "At that new Italian place on Armitage. He was with an older woman. I almost came over to say hello, but they looked so engrossed in conversation I didn't want to interrupt." The bottle in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. An older woman. David was 63. Who could be older than him at a romantic-looking restaurant on a Tuesday evening when he'd told me he was working late? "Oh," I managed. "That must have been a client." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Of course. Well, tell him I said hello." I don't remember finishing my shopping. I don't remember driving home. What I do remember is sitting in our kitchen, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call him, wondering if I was being paranoid, wondering if 32 years of marriage had taught me anything about the man I'd given my entire adult life to. That night, I pretended everything was fine. David came home at 9, kissed me on the cheek, and complained about traffic. I served him dinner and watched him eat it, searching his face for signs of deception. But there was nothing. Just David, eating pot roast, scrolling through his phone, completely normal. I know you're thinking I should have confronted him right then. I can practically hear you shouting at me through your screen. But you don't understand what 32 years does to you. It builds this fortress of routine and trust and shared history that feels impossible to question without destroying everything. So I didn't question. Not yet. Instead, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. And that's when I noticed things I'd been blind to for months, maybe years. The way he angled his phone away from me when he texted. The new cologne. The gym membership he'd suddenly insisted on renewing after years of saying he was too busy for exercise. The late nights that had become so frequent, I'd stopped counting them. But none of that compared to what came next. 2 weeks after Sarah's comment at the grocery store, I was cleaning David's home office. Something I rarely did because he always said he had a system and didn't want me messing with it. But he was out of town at a conference, or so he'd said, and I'd noticed the trash was overflowing. That's when I found the receipt. Crumpled at the bottom of his wastebasket, partially torn but still readable. A hotel in downtown Chicago. The Peninsula. Room service for two. Champagne. Chocolate-covered strawberries. A total that made my stomach turn. Dated from last Tuesday. The Tuesday he'd told me he was working late at the office. I sat down hard on his leather desk chair, the receipt trembling in my hands. This was real. This wasn't paranoia or insecurity or a misunderstanding. This was proof. But proof of what, exactly? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a client meeting. Maybe the company was paying for it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Even as I thought these things, I knew I was lying to myself. You know that feeling when you know the truth but you're not ready to face it? When accepting reality means accepting that everything you thought was solid is actually built on sand? That was where I was, teetering on the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to fall into. I put the receipt in my pocket and finished cleaning his office, moving like a robot, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. When David came home that evening, I was in the kitchen pretending to read a cookbook. "How was the conference?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Exhausting," he said, loosening his tie. "You know how these things are. Endless panels and networking events." "Did you stay at the conference hotel?" He paused for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see the lie forming. "Yeah, the Marriott out by O'Hare. Nothing fancy." The Peninsula was downtown, nowhere near O'Hare. I nodded and went back to my cookbook, and David had no idea that in that moment, something fundamental had broken between us, that the woman who had spent 3 decades believing everything he said had just learned he was a liar. That night, I lay awake beside him in our bed, listening to him breathe, and I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The man I'd trusted with everything, the man I'd built my entire existence around, was a stranger, and I had no idea what to do about it. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I lied to David. I told him I was meeting my sister for lunch in the suburbs and wouldn't be home until evening. Instead, I drove to the Peninsula Hotel and sat in my car across the street, watching the entrance like some character in a bad thriller. I felt ridiculous. I felt desperate. I felt like I was going insane. But I couldn't stop myself. Because if I was wrong, if this was all some terrible misunderstanding, I needed to know. And if I was right, well, I needed to know that too. I sat there for 3 hours, drinking cold coffee from a drive-through cup, watching people come and go. Businessmen in suits, tourists with shopping bags, couples holding hands. And then I saw him. David, walking out of the hotel with a woman I'd never seen before. She was older than me, probably in her late 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and expensive clothes. They weren't touching, but there was an intimacy in the way they walked together, a comfortable closeness that made my chest tighten. They stood outside the hotel for a moment, talking, and then David leaned in and kissed her. Not a friendly peck, a real kiss. The kind of kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. I sat frozen in my car, watching my marriage end in real time. They separated, and the woman got into a black town car that had been waiting at the curb. David watched her drive away, then pulled out his phone and started typing, a small smile on his face. My phone buzzed. A text from David. "Meeting running late. Don't wait up for dinner." I read those words 3 times, trying to process the audacity, the complete and utter lack of conscience. He was lying to me while I sat 50 feet away, watching him lie. That's when something inside me shifted. The shock and pain began to crystallize into something else, something harder, something cold. I drove home in a daze, but by the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, what else was David hiding? You have to understand. I'd given up everything for this man. I'd left my teaching career when it was just starting to take off because David needed help building his business. I'd moved across the country twice for his career opportunities. I'd put my own dreams on hold, year after year, because I believed we were a team, because I believed in us. I later learned that 66% of victims have separated and returned at least once before finally leaving for good. I understand that statistic now. Because even with everything I'd seen, part of me still wanted to believe there was an explanation. Part of me still wanted to save what we had. But that part was getting smaller every day. I need you to understand something. I wasn't some naive housewife who couldn't see what was right in front of her. I was an educated woman, a former teacher, someone who prided themselves on being observant and analytical. But love, real deep love built over decades, it doesn't make you blind. It makes you paralyzed. It makes you question your own sanity rather than question the person you've trusted with your entire life. For the next 2 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the perfect wife. I made David's coffee exactly how he liked it. I attended his business dinners and charmed his clients. I asked about his day and pretended to believe his answers. But at night, after he fell asleep, I became someone else entirely. A detective, an investigator, someone methodically uncovering the truth. I started with his credit card statements. David had always handled our finances, something I'd been happy to let him do, because I trusted him, and because, honestly, I found it boring. But now I requested copies of every statement from the past year, telling the credit card company I needed them for tax purposes. What I found made me physically ill. The Peninsula Hotel wasn't a one-time thing. He'd been there monthly for the past 8 months, sometimes more, always ordering room service for 2, always charging bottles of expensive wine, always staying for exactly 3 hours, which I knew from his meticulous calendar that he kept synchronized across all his devices. There were other hotels too, the Langham, the Park Hyatt, always downtown, always during times he'd told me he was working late or at business meetings. But it was the jewelry purchases that really gutted me. Tiffany & Co., 3 separate purchases over the past 6 months, totaling nearly $20,000. I'd received nothing, not on my birthday, not on our anniversary, not on any holiday. $20,000 worth of jewelry for another woman, paid for with our money. Money I'd helped him earn by sacrificing my own career. I found the receipts for flowers, weekly deliveries to an address in Gold Coast I didn't recognize. I found restaurant charges at places we'd never been together. I found evidence of an entire secret life he'd been living right under my nose. And through it all, I said nothing. I smiled and cooked his meals and kissed him goodnight, while inside I was dying a little more each day. My daughter, Jennifer, called one evening while I was going through David's latest credit card statement. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. "You've seemed distracted lately." I almost told her. The words were right there, pressing against my throat, desperate to escape. But I swallowed them back down. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." "Are you sure? Because Dad mentioned you've been acting strange." That stopped me cold. David had noticed. After all my careful pretending, he'd still noticed something was off, which meant I needed to be even more careful. "I've just been stressed about some things," I said vaguely. "Nothing to worry about." After I hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen of our beautiful home and wondered how much my daughter knew, if she was part of this somehow. If David had confided in her, if she was keeping his secrets while I fell apart. But no, I couldn't let myself go down that path. Not without proof. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was what it did to my sense of reality. I started questioning everything, every conversation we'd ever had, every time he'd told me he loved me, every moment I'd thought we were happy. Had any of it been real? Or had I been living in a fantasy of my own creation while David built an entirely separate life? I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard him on the phone with her. I'd check and recheck his calendar, trying to find patterns, trying to predict when he'd see her next. I'd stand in the shower and cry silently, then emerge with a smile on my face because I couldn't let him know I knew. It was exhausting, soul-crushing. But I kept going because I needed to know everything before I confronted him. I needed to be armed with so much evidence that he couldn't lie his way out of it. I hired a private investigator, used money from an account David didn't know about, my old savings from before we got married that I'd never touched. The investigator's name was Marcus, and he was professional and discreet and completely unfazed by my story. "You'd be surprised how common this is," he told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood. "Especially with successful men in their 60s. They're scared of aging, scared of death, so they try to recapture their youth through affairs." "She's older than him," I said quietly. "The woman he's seeing. She's not some young secretary." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "That's unusual. Do you know anything about her?" I shook my head. "That's what I need you to find out." It took Marcus 3 weeks to compile a complete dossier on David's mistress. Her name was Victoria Ashford. She was 67 years old, a widow, and according to Marcus's research, very wealthy. Old money wealthy. The kind of wealth that came from generations of careful investments and trust funds. She lived in a penthouse in Gold Coast, the same address I'd found on the flower receipts. She served on several charity boards. She was active in Chicago's social scene, and according to multiple sources, she'd been seeing my husband for at least a year. A year. 12 months of lies. 12 months of him coming home to me after being with her. 12 months of me being completely clueless. But it was Marcus's final piece of information that truly shattered me. Victoria Ashford was dying. Stage 4 cancer with a prognosis of less than 2 years, and she'd recently changed her will. Marcus couldn't get the details, but his source at the law firm suggested a significant portion of her estate was being left to David. That's when I understood. This wasn't about love or passion or a midlife crisis. This was about money. My husband was courting a dying wealthy woman for her fortune. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, reading Marcus's report, and I literally couldn't breathe. The man I'd loved for 32 years, the man I'd built my entire life around, was a gold digger, a con artist, someone willing to seduce a dying woman for her money, and I'd enabled him, by giving up my career, by trusting him with our finances, by being the supportive wife who asked no questions and made no demands. I'd made myself the perfect mark. That night, I made dinner like always. I set the table with our wedding china. I lit candles. I opened a bottle of the expensive wine David liked. And when he came home, I greeted him with a smile. "What's the occasion?" he asked, clearly pleased. "No occasion," I said sweetly. "I just wanted to remind you what you have here at home." He kissed me then. Really kissed me for the first time in months, and I kissed him back while imagining his face when I finally showed him everything I knew. We had dinner. We talked about our days, his filled with lies and mine with carefully crafted half-truths. We laughed at a story he told about a difficult client. We did the dishes together, side by side at the sink, like we'd done thousands of times before, and the whole time I was screaming inside. After dinner, I excused myself to take a bath. I locked the bathroom door, sat on the edge of the tub, and finally let myself fall apart. Silent sobs that shook my entire body, tears that wouldn't stop, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it feels like it might never end. I thought about the years I'd given him, the dreams I'd deferred, the person I'd stopped being because I was so busy being his wife, and for what? So he could betray me with a dying woman for her money? But something else was happening too, beneath the pain. A kind of clarity was forming, a cold, hard understanding of what I needed to do. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. I wasn't going to quietly accept this betrayal and slink away with whatever scraps David decided to throw me in a divorce settlement. No, I was going to fight back, and I was going to make sure David regretted ever underestimating me. I dried my tears, reapplied my makeup, and went back downstairs. David was in his office, on the phone. I could hear him through the door, his voice low and intimate. "I'll see you Thursday," he was saying. "I'm looking forward to it too." I stood outside his office, listening to my husband make plans with his mistress, and I felt something inside me turn to ice. The last remnants of the woman who'd believed in him, who'd trusted him, who'd loved him, died in that hallway. What was born in her place was someone David had never met before, someone he'd severely underestimated, someone who was about to show him exactly what happens when you betray a woman who spent 32 years learning how to be patient. I walked away from his office door and went upstairs to our bedroom. I opened my laptop and began making plans. Real plans. Not emotional reactions or revenge fantasies, but careful, methodical strategies that would protect me and everything I'd sacrificed for this marriage. Because here's what David didn't know. I might have given up my teaching career, but I'd never stopped being smart. I'd never stopped being capable. I'd never stopped being someone who could learn and adapt and fight when necessary. He'd made a critical mistake. He'd confused my love for weakness, my trust for stupidity, my devotion for passivity, and that mistake was going to cost him everything. The next morning, I woke up early and made David his favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with chives from our garden, wheat toast, lightly buttered, fresh squeezed orange juice. I served it to him with a smile, and he barely looked up from his phone. "Thanks, Maggie," he said absently, using the nickname he'd called me since we were dating. I watched him eat the breakfast I'd made with such care, and I felt nothing. No love, no anger, just a cold calculation of what came next. That afternoon, I met with my own lawyer. Not the family attorney David and I had used for years, but someone new. Someone who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. Her name was Catherine Price, and she listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. "Do you want to save the marriage?" she asked when I finished. I didn't even have to think about it. "No." "Good. Because what I'm about to advise you to do won't be pleasant, but it will protect your interests." Over the next hour, Catherine laid out a strategy. First, we'd gather every piece of evidence we could about David's affair and his financial dealings. Then, we'd quietly secure my portion of our assets. Finally, when everything was in place, we'd file for divorce and go for everything we could legally get. "Illinois is a no-fault divorce state," Catherine explained, "but we can still use his affair as leverage in negotiations, especially if we can prove he was planning to leave you for this other woman and her money." I signed her retainer agreement right there, using money from the same secret account I'd used to hire Marcus. Money David didn't know existed. Over the next month, I became someone I barely recognized. By day, I was Margaret Chen, devoted wife. By night, I was a woman on a mission, gathering evidence, securing assets, and building a case that would obliterate any sympathy David might hope for in a divorce. I photographed documents. I copied files from his computer when he wasn't looking. I recorded conversations with my phone tucked in my pocket. I documented every lie, every late night, every suspicious charge. And through it all, I smiled and cooked and pretended nothing was wrong. My neighbor Carol noticed something was off. She'd lived next door for 15 years and could read me better than most people. "Margaret, are you okay?" she asked one morning when she caught me sitting in my car in the driveway, staring at nothing. "You seem different lately." I almost told her. The words were right there, but I swallowed them back. "Just tired," I said. "You know how it is." But Carol wasn't buying it. She'd been through her own divorce 5 years earlier, ugly and public and devastating. She looked at me with understanding that went beyond words. "If you ever need to talk," she said quietly, "I'm here, about anything." That small gesture of kindness nearly broke me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and Carol squeezed my hand before walking back to her house. It's funny how you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. I had friends, family, a daughter who called regularly, but I couldn't tell any of them what was happening. Because once I spoke it out loud, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. So I kept my secret and gathered my evidence and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. I was going through David's jacket pocket looking for his phone charger when I found a small velvet box. My heart stopped. I opened it slowly, already knowing what I'd find. A ring. Not just any ring. A massive diamond engagement ring that must have cost a fortune. For a second, I let myself believe it was for me. Some grand romantic gesture to renew our vows or celebrate an anniversary. But I knew better. This ring was for Victoria. David was planning to propose to his dying mistress. I stood in our closet, holding this ring, and I realized I was done waiting. Done gathering evidence, done pretending. It was time. I took the ring with me and drove to Catherine's office. I handed her the velvet box without a word. She opened it, examined the ring, and let out a low whistle. This must have cost at least $50,000. "From our joint account, I'm sure," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Flat. Empty. "This changes things," Catherine said. "This shows intent. He's not just having an affair. He's planning a future with another woman while still married to you." "Can we use this?" "Absolutely. This is exactly the kind of evidence that will make a judge very sympathetic to your case." I nodded slowly. "Then let's do it. File the papers. I want him served tomorrow." Catherine raised her eyebrows. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back." I thought about the last 32 years. The dreams I'd given up. The person I'd stopped being. The lies David had told me while planning a future with another woman. "I'm sure." That night, I made one final dinner for my husband. I didn't tell him it would be our last. I just cooked his favorite meal, set the table beautifully, and pretended everything was normal. We ate in near silence. David was distracted, checking his phone constantly. Probably texting Victoria, probably making plans for their future together. I watched him and felt nothing. The woman who'd loved this man had died somewhere between the Peninsula Hotel and this dining room table. What remained was someone harder. Someone who'd learned that trust is a luxury and love is a weapon that can be used against you. "I'm going to visit my sister this weekend," I told him over dessert. It was a lie. I had no sister. But David didn't question it. He never questioned anything I said. "That's nice," he said absently. "I have to work this weekend anyway." I'm sure he did. With Victoria, planning their future while I packed up the pieces of mine. That night, I lay awake beside him one last time, listening to him breathe, and I mourned the life I thought I had, the partnership I thought we'd built, the future I thought we'd share. But I didn't mourn the woman I used to be. That woman was too trusting, too willing to sacrifice herself for someone else's dreams, too afraid of being alone to demand better. The woman I was becoming didn't have those weaknesses. She'd learned them the hard way, and she was ready to make sure David learned them too. The next morning, David left for work like always, kissed me goodbye like always, told me he loved me like always. And I let him go, knowing a process server was waiting at his office with divorce papers and a demand for immediate asset preservation. I didn't stick around to watch it happen. Instead, I drove to Carol's house and knocked on her door. "I need your help," I said when she answered. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside without a word. That's where I was when my phone started buzzing with calls from David. That's where I was when the text messages started coming in, furious and desperate and confused. Carol made me tea and sat beside me on her couch, and I finally told her everything. The affair, the dying mistress, the engagement ring, the plan to steal a fortune while I sat at home being the good wife. When I finished, Carol was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. A betrayal this deep doesn't heal. It scars over. And you have to decide if you want to carry that scar or cut it out completely. I looked at her, this neighbor who'd become an unexpected ally, and I knew my answer. I was cutting it out. All of it. David, the life we'd built, the woman I'd been when I thought love meant sacrifice instead of partnership. I was going to burn it all down and rebuild from the ashes, and this time I was building something that belonged only to me. My phone kept buzzing. David's calls became more frequent, more desperate. I didn't answer. Let him wonder. Let him panic. Let him feel a fraction of the uncertainty and fear I'd felt these past months. Catherine called instead. "He got the papers," she said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "His attorney already called me. They want to talk settlement." "No settlement," I said. "Not yet. Let him sweat." "You're sure?" I thought about the years I'd given him, the dreams I'd deferred, the person I'd diminished myself to be. "I'm sure." That evening, David showed up at Carol's house. I watched from the window as he rang the doorbell, paced on the porch, rang again. Carol looked at me. "Do you want me to send him away?" I shook my head. "No, I'll talk to him." I opened the door but didn't invite him in. We stood on opposite sides of the threshold, 32 years of marriage between us like a canyon. "What the hell is this, Margaret?" He waved the divorce papers in my face. "Some kind of joke?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. "No joke. I want a divorce." "Because of what?" "We can work through whatever this is. We always do." "We can't work through you planning to marry Victoria Ashford the second she changes her will in your favor." The color drained from his face. For the first time in months, I saw real emotion there. Fear, panic, the look of someone who'd been caught. "I don't know what you're talking about," he started, but his voice was shaking. I pulled out the engagement ring box and held it up. "Really? Then what's this?" He reached for it, but I stepped back. "I know everything, David, about Victoria, about the hotels, about the money, about all of it." "It's not what you think." I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to my ears. "It never is it? But I have evidence, months of it, credit card statements, hotel receipts, photographs, recordings, everything." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "She means nothing to me. It was just, don't." My voice was sharp. "Don't insult me by lying anymore. I know she's dying. I know about her money. I know you've been planning your future with her while I made your dinners and believed your lies. Margaret, please, we can fix this." "There's nothing to fix. You broke it. You broke us. And I'm done trying to hold together something that was already destroyed." I handed him the ring box. "Give this to Victoria. Or don't. I don't care anymore." He looked at me like he'd never seen me before. "What happened to you?" "You did," I said simply. "You happened to me, and I finally woke up." I closed the door in his face and stood there, shaking, listening to him knock and call my name. Eventually, he gave up and left. Carol appeared beside me with a glass of wine. That was brave. I took the wine and drank half of it in one swallow. That was necessary. There's a difference. Over the next weeks, the divorce proceedings moved forward with brutal efficiency. David's attorney tried to negotiate, tried to find compromises, tried to preserve some of his assets. But Catherine was relentless, and the evidence I'd gathered left little room for David to maneuver. The engagement ring became particularly damaging evidence. When the judge saw that David had spent $50,000 of marital assets on a ring for his mistress while planning to leave his wife, the sympathy shifted dramatically in my favor. My daughter Jennifer called, confused and hurt. "Mom, Dad says you're divorcing him over nothing, that you're having some kind of breakdown." I closed my eyes. Of course he'd try to make me look crazy. That's what people like David do when they're caught. They gaslight and manipulate and try to rewrite history. "Sweetheart, your father has been having an affair for over a year. He's been seeing a wealthy woman named Victoria Ashford and planning to leave me for her money." Silence on the other end, then quietly, "Are you sure?" "I have evidence, months of it. If you want to see it, I'll show you. But I won't try to turn you against your father. You'll have to decide for yourself what kind of man he is." Another pause. "I believe you, Mom. I can't believe he'd do this to you. To us." "Neither could I said softly. "But he did. And now I have to figure out who I am without him." That conversation was harder than confronting David, because Jennifer was collateral damage in this war, an innocent casualty of her father's choices. But she stood by me. She came to Catherine's office and reviewed the evidence herself, and when she was done, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I had no idea." "Neither did I said, "until I did." The divorce took 6 months to finalize. 6 months of legal battles and financial disclosures and endless negotiations. David fought for everything, tried to hide assets, tried to claim I was entitled to nothing because I hadn't worked in years. But Catherine was better than his attorney, and the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the judge awarded me half of everything: the house, his retirement accounts, his business, all of it split down the middle. Did you know that in high-conflict divorces, the average case takes 18 months and costs both parties over $50,000 in legal fees? I learned that statistic during one of Catherine's strategy sessions. We beat the average by a full year, and every penny of legal fees was worth it. David's face when the judge read the final decree was something I'll never forget. Shock, disbelief. The realization that his plan had completely backfired. He'd lost his wife, half his fortune, and his reputation. All for a dying woman who, according to Marcus's sources, had recently removed David from her will entirely once she learned he was married. Karma, it turned out, had a sense of humor. As I sat in that courtroom, listening to the judge dissolve our marriage, I waited to feel something: sadness, relief, anger, victory. But all I felt was tired. Bone deep, exhausted from months of fighting and strategizing and pretending to be okay. It was over. 32 years reduced to legal documents and asset divisions. A lifetime of memories tainted by lies I could never unknow. I signed the papers with steady hands. David's were shaking. Poetic justice, I suppose. Outside the courthouse, rain was falling. Again. Like the universe was marking these transitions with weather. Catherine walked me to my car, her umbrella keeping us both dry. "What will you do now?" she asked. I looked up at the gray Chicago sky and realized I had no idea. For the first time in over 3 decades, I didn't have to consider David's career or schedule or needs. I didn't have to be anyone's wife or supporter or second priority. "I don't know," I said honestly, "and that's terrifying. But it's also kind of exciting." Catherine smiled. "You're going to be fine, Margaret. Better than fine." I wanted to believe her, but standing there in the rain, newly divorced and completely unmoored, I wasn't sure what fine even looked like anymore. I drove to the house, David's half now belonging to me completely. He'd already moved out, taking his clothes and his lies and his regrets with him. The house felt different, emptier, but also somehow lighter. I walked through rooms I'd decorated and cleaned and lived in for years, seeing them with new eyes. This was my space now, my home, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. That realization hit me like a physical force. I could redecorate. I could paint the walls colors David had always vetoed. I could get rid of his ugly leather furniture and replace it with something I actually liked. I could plant flowers in the garden that he'd always said would attract too many bees. For the first time in months, I felt something other than pain or anger or exhaustion. I felt possibility. I started small. Threw out his favorite chair that I'd always hated. Donated his books that had taken up half the study. Removed every photograph of us together from the walls. Carol came over and helped me, the two of us working in companionable silence, dismantling the life I used to have box by box. "What are you going to do with all this space?" she asked, gesturing to the now empty study. "I have no idea," I said. "But it's going to be for me, not for some man's career or hobbies or convenience, just me." She smiled. "Good. It's about damn time." That night, I sat in my newly reclaimed living room with a glass of wine and my laptop, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked up graduate programs for counseling and psychology. Before I'd married David, before I'd become Mrs. Chen, I'd wanted to be a therapist. I'd wanted to help people navigate the messy, complicated business of being human. But David had needed help with his business, and my dreams had gotten shelved. Temporarily, I told myself, until we were more established, until we had more time, until became never, and never became 32 wasted years. But maybe it wasn't too late. I was 58, not 88. I had time. I had money now, more than enough to go back to school. I had nothing holding me back except my own fear. I filled out an application to Northwestern's counseling program. My hands were shaking, but I filled it out anyway. I wrote an essay about my life experiences and what I hoped to bring to the field. I requested transcripts from my undergraduate degree earned decades ago, and then I hit submit before I could talk myself out of it. 3 weeks later, I got an acceptance letter. They wanted me to start in the fall semester, 6 months away. I sat in my kitchen reading that letter over and over, tears streaming down my face. But for once, they weren't tears of pain or betrayal. They were tears of something that felt almost like hope. I called Jennifer. "I'm going back to school." "Mom, that's amazing. For what?" "Counseling. I want to be a therapist." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to be incredible at that. After everything you've been through, you'll be able to really help people." After we hung up, I thought about her words. After everything I'd been through. Would I have chosen this path if David hadn't betrayed me? Would I have ever found the courage to reclaim my dreams if he hadn't destroyed my illusions? I didn't know. But I was grateful for where I was now, even if the journey to get here had been devastating. That summer, before school started, I did something else I'd never done. I took a trip. By myself. Just me and a suitcase and a plane ticket to somewhere David had never wanted to go. I chose Italy, Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast. Places I'd dreamed of seeing since I was a girl. David had always said European vacations were overrated, that we should focus on business trips and practical travel. I spent 2 weeks wandering ancient streets, eating incredible food, and talking to strangers who didn't know anything about my past. I was just Margaret, not anyone's wife or mother or victim, just Margaret. In Florence, I met a group of women on a similar journey, divorced, widowed, or simply taking time for themselves. We had dinner together one evening, sharing stories and wine and laughter. One of them, a woman named Susan from Boston, looked at me over her pasta and said, "Can I tell you something? You look free, like you've just been let out of a cage you didn't even know you were in." She was right. That's exactly how I felt. Free, untethered, terrifyingly and wonderfully on my own. I came home from that trip with a tan, a full camera roll, and a new understanding of who I could be. David had tried to make me small, to fit into his vision of what a wife should be. But I'd never been small. I'd just been compressed, folded in on myself, diminished. Now I was unfolding, expanding, becoming. Graduate school was harder than I expected. I was decades older than most of my classmates, and the technology had changed dramatically since my undergraduate days. But I loved it. Every difficult assignment, every late night studying, Every challenging concept was proof that I was still capable of growth and change. My classmates were respectful, curious about my life experience. My professors appreciated my perspective, the way I could connect theory to real-world situations they'd only read about in textbooks. I excelled in classes about trauma and recovery, about rebuilding identity after loss, about recognizing manipulation and gaslighting. I wrote papers about financial abuse and how it traps victims in dangerous situations. I researched the psychological impact of betrayal and how it affects a person's ability to trust. Everything I'd lived through became valuable, not just painful memories, but educational tools, ways to understand and help others going through similar experiences. One of my professors pulled me aside after a particularly intense class discussion. "Margaret, you have a gift for this work. Your insights are going to help a lot of people someday." I thought about David, about Victoria, about the months I'd spent gathering evidence and planning my escape, about all the pain that had led me here. "I hope so," I said. "I really hope so." 2 years passed. I completed my degree, passed my licensing exams, and started working at a community counseling center in Chicago. My clients were mostly women, many of them dealing with relationship issues and betrayal. I saw pieces of myself in each of them, but I also saw their unique strength and resilience. I learned that healing isn't linear, that some days you feel strong and capable, and other days you wake up crying over someone who hurt you years ago. That forgiveness is optional, and closure is a myth we tell ourselves to feel better about unfinished business. I learned that you can build a good life from the ruins of a destroyed one, that starting over at 58 is just as valid as starting over at 28, that the best revenge isn't some elaborate plot or public humiliation, but simply living well and finding peace. David tried to contact me occasionally, emails that I deleted without reading, text messages that I blocked, phone calls that went straight to voicemail. He'd lost everything, according to Jennifer. His business had suffered when word of the affair got out. Victoria had died without leaving him a dime. He was alone and apparently regretful. But his regret wasn't my responsibility. His consequences weren't my problem. I'd spent enough years managing his emotions and cleaning up his messes. Now I was managing my own life, and it was gloriously uncomplicated by his needs. Carol and I became close friends. She introduced me to her book club, and I introduced her to my graduate school friends. We took trips together, tried new restaurants, attended concerts and plays. We built the kind of friendship that had nothing to do with our former marriages and everything to do with who we were becoming. "You know what I love about you?" Carol said to me one evening over dinner. "You turned your pain into purpose. You didn't just survive David's betrayal. You used it as fuel to become someone better." I thought about that. Had I become better or just different? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the point was that I'd kept growing instead of staying stuck in bitterness and anger. "I had good help," I said, raising my glass to her. "I couldn't have done it alone." She clinked her glass against mine. "Yes, you could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." On the 3rd anniversary of my divorce, I did something symbolic. I took off my wedding ring, which I'd worn on a chain around my neck for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I drove to the shore of Lake Michigan and threw it into the water. It barely made a splash, just a tiny plunk, and then it was gone, sinking into the depths where I'd never see it again. I stood there for a long time, watching the waves, feeling the wind on my face. And I realized I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was just here, in this moment, completely present and completely at peace. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in months. I wrote about the journey from betrayal to rebuilding, about the woman I used to be and the woman I'd become, about the lessons learned and the wisdom gained through suffering. And at the end, I wrote something that felt like a conclusion and a beginning all at once. I don't regret loving David. I regret not loving myself enough to demand better, but I'm learning. Every day I'm learning what I deserve and what I won't tolerate. And that's worth more than any marriage ever was. So here I am, 5 years after that day at the grocery store when Sarah's comment first planted the seed of doubt. 5 years after I started my journey from naive wife to divorced woman to counselor, helping others navigate their own betrayals. I have a career I love, friends who support me, a daughter who respects the strength it took to rebuild my life, a granddaughter who sees me as an example of resilience. And I have myself, fully and completely, no longer diminished or compressed or folded in on myself to fit someone else's vision. Just me, Margaret Chen, 58 years old, divorced, starting over, and absolutely thriving. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this, something that might help you if you're going through something similar, or if you know someone who is. The hardest part about recognizing manipulation in a relationship isn't seeing the obvious red flags. It's understanding the subtle ways manipulators isolate you from your own judgment. They make you question your perceptions, doubt your memories, and feel like you're going crazy when you're actually seeing the truth. I learned that there are specific warning signs of this kind of emotional abuse. Constant deflection when you raise concerns, making you feel guilty for having normal needs or boundaries, withholding affection or communication as punishment, creating a version of reality that benefits them while making you feel like you're the problem. Here's what I wish someone had told me years ago. Your feelings are valid. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your gut, even when everyone around you says you're being paranoid or oversensitive. Your instincts developed over a lifetime of experiences, and they're trying to protect you. If you're in a relationship where you constantly feel confused, where the story keeps changing, where you're always apologizing but never quite sure what you did wrong, you might be experiencing manipulation, and you deserve better. Practical steps you can take. Start documenting things. Keep a journal of conversations and events. Take screenshots of texts and emails. Not because you're paranoid, but because manipulators will deny things they said or did, and you need to trust your own memory. Open a bank account in your own name if you don't have one. Even if it's just a small savings account, have something that's yours alone. Talk to someone outside the relationship, a friend, a therapist, even a hotline. Isolation is a manipulator's best tool, and breaking that isolation is your best defense. Tell them what's happening without minimizing or making excuses, just the facts. And most importantly, you are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not the problem. You are someone who loved deeply and trusted completely. And that's not a weakness. It's a strength that someone chose to exploit. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. They're available 24/7, and they can help you figure out if what you're experiencing is abuse and what your options are. There's also the National Elder Abuse Hotline at 1-800-677-1116, because financial exploitation and emotional abuse don't just happen to young people. Remember, leaving isn't always immediate. I gathered evidence for months before I was ready to file for divorce. That's okay. Safety and preparation matter more than speed. Do what you need to do to protect yourself in whatever timeline works for you. And if you've already left, if you're in the rebuilding phase like I was, know that it gets better, not immediately, not in a straight line, but gradually, day by day. You'll reclaim pieces of yourself you'd forgotten existed. You'll rediscover dreams you'd shelved. You'll become someone you actually like being. The journey from victim to survivor to thriver is long and often painful, but it's also full of unexpected joy and profound growth. You'll surprise yourself with your own strength. You'll discover capabilities you never knew you had. You'll build a life that belongs entirely to you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this very long and very personal story. I hope it helped you in some way, whether you're going through something similar or you just needed to hear that people can survive devastating betrayals and come out stronger on the other side. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop a comment and let me know. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt seen or understood or less alone, please consider hitting that like button. It helps other people who might need to hear this find it. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted David immediately? Or would you have gathered evidence like I did? Would you have tried to salvage the marriage? Or would you have walked away the moment you found out? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, so please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. I share stories of resilience, betrayal, and overcoming impossible situations. Every story is different, but they all have one thing in common: